In 1801, Europe had been at war for nearly a decade, each of the great powers interchangeably attempting to contain the revolutionary expansionism of the French Republic. But as the new century began, it was clear that this had comprehensively failed. In 1799, a coup staged by rising General Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the unstable Directory and ended the coalition's hopes for an internal restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Their fate was even worse on the battlefield. Two crushing French victories at Hohenlinden and Marengo had left the Austrian military position untenable. In 1801, they backed out of the conflict with a peace at Luneville. In doing so, they allowed the France of First Consul Bonaparte to isolate its last enemy, Great Britain. The British had been the most reluctant of the European powers to fight France over the revolution, but by this time they had become her most committed enemy. The French may have dominated the continent, but so long as they were at war with Britain, they were quarantined to Europe by the power of the Royal Navy. The result was a strategic stalemate that could potentially go on indefinitely. The reality was, however, that war was increasingly counterproductive for both nations. The British blockade had shattered French commerce and restricted its efforts to project power anywhere else in the world. Most pressingly of all, war got in the way of Bonaparte's plans to establish total control over his country. Yet Britain was hardly better off. The defeat of Austria left London with no prospects of beating the French on land. Whilst Britain's naval supremacy was essentially unchallenged and the French colonial empire mopped up, other European states were not altogether pleased with the power this gave London, as the League of Armed Neutrality and disputes with Russia in 1801 drove home, putting the country in an even more tenuous position. The general mood of the nation was also for peace, compounded when William Pitt, a steadfast advocate of the war, resigned over Catholic emancipation. The new government was formed by Henry Addington, with Lord Hawkesbury as his foreign secretary. They resolved to search for an end to the conflict. Both powers knew the terms of any treaty were vital to their future prospects, but both also needed peace to reorganise and consolidate. Bonaparte's major ambition was to cement the gains of the Revolutionary Wars, France's natural borders, his position in Belgium, from where Britain could be threatened with invasion, and his Italian client state, which he viewed as a sort of protégé. Peace would allow France to look once more to the world beyond Europe, specifically in the Americas, where Bonaparte had ambitions of forging a new empire, if he could regain France's old colonies. For Britain, the objectives were more nuanced. International opinion was much more important in London, which depended heavily on trade. Thus, French and Dutch colonies seized over the previous 10 years would be used as bargaining chips as opposed to unnegotiable gains. Victory for Britain at these talks was containing French expansionism. This meant achieving some form of independence for the Netherlands and Italy. It would also mean maintaining strategic assets should the peace fail. Britain, however, did not go into the negotiations believing war would be necessary again, and did hope for a lasting settlement, unlike Bonaparte. In March 1801, discussions opened. Hawkesbury proposed the French should evacuate Egypt, still tenuously held by French forces left over from Bonaparte's expedition there, in return for a British withdrawal from Majorca, which would leave Britain with effectively all of the French and Dutch colonies seized in the war. Bonaparte proposed Britain give up all of its wartime gains, along with territory taken from the late Tipu Sultan in India. The mutual outrageousness of these proposals implies both sides knew they were merely opening gambits. Time, however, seemed to be on Britain's side. The assassination of Tsar Paul, who had recently favoured France in international affairs, and Nelson's attack on the Danish fleet broke up the League of Armed Neutrality in June 1801. Meanwhile, a British expedition had landed in Egypt to finally eject the French, and besieged Alexandria. On the 5th of August, however, Hawkesbury told Otto, the French negotiator, that Britain may be willing to allow Malta to become independent, thus denying the use of a strategically vital island to the Royal Navy. This was the concession Bonaparte had been looking for. When he learned that Alexandria had fallen on the 2nd of September, he told Otto to offer a French withdrawal from Egypt, Naples, and the Papal States before the news of the French defeat reached London. Thus, on the 1st of October 1801, to the surprise of many, Britain and France reached a preliminary peace agreement that started the process of formally bringing the French Revolutionary Wars to an end, formalising it in March 1802. The peace terms were an unmitigated triumph for the French. Under Article 2 of the treaty, Britain gave away almost all of its colonial gains in the war, including key strategic assets such as the Cape, only retaining Trinidad and Ceylon. Article 4 stipulated that Malta was to be returned to the Knights of St. John, but it was hard to see what Britain had gained in return. France promised to have its troops evacuate the Netherlands, which might leave the country open to an independent policy, whilst Naples and the Papal States were also to be abandoned. Yet these meagre offerings paled in comparison to French gains. For France, it was a peace that established her as a continental hegemon in waiting. Talleyrand, the shit in a silk stocking according to Bonaparte, but also the most brilliant French diplomat of the day, foresaw, as Bismarck did 70 years later with Germany, that France had achieved the limits of her power. Paris held a position that would, in time, leave its strength unrivaled in Europe. Paul Schroeder has argued that Britain in 1802 would have tacitly consented to a peaceful, non-expansionist French hegemony in Western Europe, which would have formed part of a real balance of power, with France dominant in Western Europe, Britain on the seas, and Russia in Eastern Europe. Addington and Hawkesbury genuinely wanted Amiens to lay the ground for a lasting peace, yet all their appeasement of Bonaparte seems to have done is convince him the British were weak. They had already been faced with clear signs Bonaparte was a fundamentally untrustworthy actor during the negotiations. For example, he had privately committed to find suitable compensation for the dethroned Prince of Orange, yet proceeded to use the issue to wring more concessions out of the British. In 1802, he had violated the Peace of Luneville by effectively seizing the presidency of the Cisalpine Republic, his Italian client state. Britain was rankled but took no action, not least because, as the British themselves accepted, there was little actual hostility to Bonaparte's election. However, practically before the ink on the treaty was dry, it became clear he had no intention of it being a final settlement. Addington and Hawkesbury were faced with numerous instances of French bad faith over the next 14 months. From the dispatch of General Duquesne on one side of the globe to govern Pondicherry with the instructions to intrigue with Indian powers and recruit an army locally, with the expectation of an early resumption of the war, to the concerning mission of General Leclerc, commanding 20,000 men and a significant naval force to put down a slave revolt in modern-day Haiti, with the intention of then going on to Louisiana. The British government were faced with moves from the French that threatened their specific interests. Combined with Bonaparte's election as President of the Italian Republic, the Republic's annexation of Parma, the annexation of Elba and Piedmont by France, French troops continuing to occupy Holland, French complaints about émigré publications, trade commissioners who were actually spies, the collapse of trade treaty talks and restrictions against British shipping in French waters, the economic clauses regarding Hanover and Brunswick being violated, there was a formidable list of issues with France. Clausewitz once said that war was the continuation of politics by other means. For Bonaparte, it was the opposite. Politics was the continuation of war by other means. Faced with this wide-ranging French activity, the British government had to somehow construct a policy that would avoid dragging the country into a conflict before the economy had recovered. Crucially as well, they had to ensure the support of public opinion and the European powers whilst not seeming to appease France. This difficult diplomatic tightrope would have been a challenge for even the most able of prime ministers and foreign secretaries. It was one that Addington and Hawkesbury managed to balance on with some credit, biding their time for the right opportunity to make a strong stand against these repeated French advances. This eventually came with the French intervention in Switzerland in October 1802. Switzerland, officially the Helvetic Republic, was torn by civil conflict that resulted from the legacies of the French Revolution, the abolition of the country's old constitution and its replacement by a unitary one under French oversight in 1798. These tensions within the country eventually boiled over in September 1802. The first consul intervened with his act of mediation and the threat of 30,000 troops to enforce it should the rebels at the Diet of Schwyz not capitulate. A representative of the Diet was dispatched to Paris to plead with the French government to allow the Swiss to settle their own affairs. He also appealed to the ambassadors of the other powers to intervene and prevent Bonaparte following through with his threat. Britain reacted swiftly to this call, dispatching a Foreign Office agent to Switzerland to ascertain the situation on the ground, and to offer aid should the rebels be determined to resist. Hawkesbury also moved to secure Austrian and Russian support, conscious of the fact that these two countries would be essential components in any system to block the growth of France's power. Direct French control would threaten Austria more than any other state. Furthermore, such a blatant and aggressive move could well push Russia into opposition to France. In the end, Russia shied away from provoking France with even a defensive alliance. This, along with a similar reaction from the Austrians, and coupled with the capitulation of the Swiss rebels, eventually brought to the end the prospect of erecting opposition to France. Nonetheless, there were genuine fears for the consequences of Bonaparte's actions on the international system, and very real concerns for their impact on the balance of power, the independence of Switzerland, and other non-great power nations. This is seen most clearly in a cabinet memorandum from the 6th of November 1802. It begins by stating that according to the law of nations, and according to the system of the balance of power, the foundation of all European policy, every independent state has a right to resist projects of encroachment and aggrandizement on the part of any other state. The international system at the time was characterised by a respect for treaties and the importance of upholding a universal set of rules that was the foundation of all European policy, something rooted in earlier 18th century practices. Bonaparte was so threatening to all of the European great powers precisely because of his disregard for these foundations in the pursuit of power for himself. Britain was not concerned with attempting aggressively to limit French expansion, but instead wanted to ensure the balance of power on the continent. As Thomas Goldsmith argues, Hawkesbury and Addington did not see the smaller states as pawns to be used against France, but as crucial parts of an international system that guaranteed security for all, including France and the smaller states themselves. A necessary part of this was that the First Consul should not exploit the system to expand the power of France at the expense of these states, with threatening consequences to all. This is why Bonaparte's actions in Switzerland were so provocative. As one memorandum put it, "Is not the independence of Switzerland an object of the highest importance to the peace and security of other states? Has not France violated that independence in the grossest manner?" British policy, far from being nakedly based on competitive power politics, was centred on a concern for the security of all states, and a belief that France was pursuing a policy contrary to all norms and damaging the interests of countries, large and small. In response to Bonaparte's refusal to withdraw from the Netherlands, and to his unilateral reorganisation of Switzerland and parts of Italy, Addington took the provocative step of ordering British forces to remain in Malta, in direct breach of the Treaty of Amiens, though much to the relief of the Maltese population. To the self-righteous French protests, Britain replied with a demand that France should evacuate the Netherlands and Switzerland in line with its treaty obligations. In Schroeder's view, Britain's demands would have effectively given their sanction to Napoleon's wider expansionism in Germany and Italy, and would not have compromised French political control of the Netherlands. Granger, too, believed that withdrawing his forces would have cost Bonaparte little or nothing. Instead, in a display of hypocrisy only Bonaparte was capable of, a storm of diplomatic protests were sent out. It was finally clear that there could be no peace with revolutionary France, and certainly not with Bonaparte. Britain in 1803 had no choice but to fight. The other option was to leave Europe to be subjected to the erratic whims of a revolutionary dictator. On the 18th of May, after the rejection of a British ultimatum demanding France abandon Switzerland, the Netherlands, and allow a continued occupation of Malta for 10 years, Britain declared war on France. Bonaparte had in 1802 established France as a victorious power, with the possibility of lasting peace. Instead, as would become a trend, his ambition got in the way of everything. It was this ambition that was to give Europe more than a decade of war, and was this ambition that was to destroy France's position in the world forever.